January 6, 1540. Richmond Palace, England. A woman stands alone in a chamber draped in silk and gold, her hands trembling as she lifts the hem of her heavy gown. The air is cold, biting against her skin, but the chill comes from within. She knows what awaits her tonight. Not love, not tenderness, not even duty performed with dignity. A door creaks open. Footsteps echo across the stone floor. The king is coming. Anne of Cleves, daughter of a German duke, raised in piety and modesty, is about to discover that marriage to the most powerful man in England will not elevate her. It will destroy her, not with violence, not with execution, but with something far more intimate, far more humiliating. A single phrase whispered in the dark, a rumor that would follow her for centuries. Between her legs, the stench of rotting fish. What happened to Anne of Cleves wasn't just rejection, it was erasure through disgust. And the truth behind those words is darker than anything you've been taught in history class. To understand what happened to Anne, you need to understand who she was before she became a punchline in Tudor history. Born in 1515 in Dusseldorf, Anne was the daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves. She was raised in a strict Protestant household, where modesty wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. She learned to read, to sew, to manage a household, but she was never taught to seduce. She was never taught to survive a man like Henry VIII. By 1539, Henry was desperate. His third wife, Jane Seymour, had died giving birth to his only son. He needed a new queen, not for love, but for alliance. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, proposed Anne of Cleves, a German princess, Protestant, politically advantageous. Henry agreed without ever meeting her. What he saw was a portrait, painted by Hans Holbein. It showed a serene woman with pale skin, delicate features, and an expression of calm dignity. Henry looked at that portrait and convinced himself he saw beauty. But portraits lie. Or perhaps Henry's expectations were simply impossible to meet. If you're interested in historical letters recovered from the Tower of London archives and Tudor court records, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us continue unearthing the truths that were buried beneath centuries of royal propaganda. Now, let's return to Richmond Palace, January 1540. The wedding took place on January 6, 1540, in the Chapel Royal at Greenwich. Anne wore cloth of gold embroidered with pearls. She looked every inch a queen, but Henry's face told a different story. According to letters written by the French ambassador, Charles de Marillac, preserved in the French National Archives, Henry looked displeased throughout the ceremony. He avoided looking directly at Anne. When he spoke his vows, his voice was flat, mechanical. Something had already broken. What no one knew yet was that Henry had met Anne days before the wedding, not at a formal reception, but in disguise. He wanted to surprise her, to see her as she truly was when she wasn't performing for a king. It was a disaster. Anne, raised in a culture where modesty meant restraint, didn't recognize him. She didn't throw herself at his feet. She didn't gasp with delight. She simply looked at this strange, fat, older man with polite confusion. Henry was humiliated. He had expected passion, recognition, the immediate chemistry that he'd felt with Anne Boleyn. Instead, he got courtesy. And courtesy, to Henry, felt like contempt. But the wedding was already arranged. Canceling it would be a political catastrophe. So Henry went through with it. And that night in the royal bedchamber, everything fell apart. What happened in that room wasn't recorded in official chronicles. Kings don't document their failures. But Henry spoke. to his doctors, to his advisors, to Thomas Cromwell, the man who had arranged this disaster, and what he said would haunt Anne for the rest of her life. "I liked her not." That phrase appears in a letter written by Thomas Cromwell to Henry's Privy Council, discovered in the British National Archives in the 19th century. But Cromwell's notes go further. Henry claimed he couldn't consummate the marriage. Not because he was incapable, he was quick to insist, but because Anne's body repulsed him. He described her breasts as hanging and slack. He said her belly disordered him. And then came the phrase that would define her in history. He said that when he came close to her, he smelled such a stench from her body that he could not proceed. Specifically, he said, the smell came from between her legs, like rotting fish. Think about that for a moment. A king, desperate for an heir, unable to perform his duty, deflects his failure onto the woman lying beside him. A woman who had done nothing wrong except fail to arouse him. But here's what makes this even darker. There's no evidence Anne had any medical condition. No contemporary source outside of Henry's private complaints mentions any smell. Her later physicians found her healthy. Her servants reported nothing unusual. So why did Henry say it? Because blaming Anne's body was the only way to protect his ego. If she was disgusting, then his impotence wasn't his fault. It was hers. The rumors spread quickly, whispered in corridors, repeated in council chambers. Within weeks, every courtier in England knew. The new queen was unclean. The king couldn't touch her. Anne herself didn't understand what was happening at first. She had been raised to believe that marriage was a sacrament, that duty and obedience were virtues. She tried to please Henry. She dressed as he liked. She learned English. She played cards with him, smiled when he spoke, stayed silent when he ignored her. But nothing worked, because the problem wasn't her behavior. It was her existence. By March 1540, Henry was already seeking an escape. He ordered his doctors to examine Anne, to find proof that the marriage hadn't been consummated. They confirmed it, but they also confirmed something else. Anne was still a virgin, not just technically, completely. Henry had never even tried, which means the stench he described was a lie, or at least an exaggeration, a weaponized disgust used to justify abandonment. But abandonment wasn't enough for Henry. He wanted annulment, legal proof that the marriage had never been real. And to get it, he needed Anne to confess something. On June 24th, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was arrested. The man who had arranged Anne's marriage, who had promised Henry a beautiful, fertile bride, was now a liability. He was executed on July 28th. Anne watched it happen from a distance. She understood the message. If she didn't cooperate, she could be next. On July 6th, a delegation arrived at Richmond Palace. Bishops, lawyers, members of the Privy Council. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to deliver an ultimatum. Anne would agree to an annulment. She would admit the marriage had never been consummated. She would surrender her title as queen, or she would face charges of treason. Anne of Cleves was 25 years old. She had been queen for 6 months. She had committed no crime. But she was a foreigner in a land that now despised her. She had no allies, no army, no family close enough to protect her. So she agreed. But here's what breaks your heart. Anne didn't just agree quietly. She wrote a letter to Henry. In her own hand, it still exists in the British National Archives. In it, she calls him her most dear, and entirely beloved brother. She thanks him for his goodness and favor. She says she will submit to his will with a glad and contented heart. Every word is a lie, but it's a lie that saved her life. Because Anne understood something that Henry's other wives didn't. Survival wasn't about pride. It was about playing the role he needed her to play. If he needed her to be disgusting, she would accept that. If he needed her to disappear, she would disappear. If he needed her to smile and call him brother while he married another woman within weeks, she would do that too. On July 9th, 1540, the marriage was annulled. Anne was given a generous settlement, 2 manor houses, a yearly income of 4,000, the title the king's beloved sister. She was never allowed to remarry, never allowed to return to Germany, never allowed to be anything other than Henry's discarded mistake. But she lived. And here's the most disturbing part. She outlived them all. Henry VIII died in 1547, bloated, diseased, raging against a body that had betrayed him. Anne of Cleves lived until 1557. She watched Henry marry 4 more times. She watched him execute 2 more wives. She watched him die alone, paranoid, convinced that God had cursed him. And through it all she smiled. She attended court. She played her role. The woman Henry called disgusting became the only one of his wives to die peacefully in her bed. Anne of Cleves was buried at Westminster Abbey on August 4, 1557. Her funeral was modest. No grand procession. No royal honors. Just a stone tomb in the south aisle, marked with her name and title. But not her real title. The inscription reads, Anne of Cleves, sister of the king. Not queen, not wife, sister. Even in death, Henry's lie persisted. For centuries, historians repeated the story. The ugly German princess, the woman so disgusting that Henry couldn't consummate the marriage, the wife who smelled like rotting fish. It became a joke, a footnote, a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't meet a king's expectations. But here's the truth that history tried to bury. Anne of Cleves wasn't disgusting. She was inconvenient. Henry needed a scapegoat for his impotence. A way to explain why, at 48 years old, obese, suffering from infected leg ulcers, he could no longer perform like the young king he imagined himself to be. So he invented a smell. And that smell became Anne's identity. Modern historians who have studied the case, including biographers like Alison Weir and Antonia Fraser, agree. There's no medical evidence, no corroborating testimony, nothing except Henry's private complaints to men who depended on him for their livelihoods. But the damage was done. Anne's reputation, her dignity, her truth were sacrificed to protect a king's ego. And here's what makes this story matter. Because this isn't just about Anne of Cleves. It's about how powerful men, throughout history, have weaponized disgust to control women. When a woman doesn't fulfill a man's fantasy, she becomes repulsive. When she doesn't perform desire on command, her body becomes the problem. When she survives rejection with dignity, her very existence is rewritten as shameful. Anne of Cleves lived for 17 years after her annulment. She learned English fluently. She managed her estates with skill. She entertained, hosted, and navigated the dangerous waters of Tudor politics with more grace than almost anyone at Henry's court. But none of that mattered, because history remembers the smell. If you heard Anne's story tonight, let it stay with you. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt when you learned how a king's lie became a woman's legacy. And if you want more untold stories buried in history's shadows, subscribe. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, especially the ones that powerful men tried to erase. Anne of Cleves didn't smell like rotting fish. She smelled like survival, and that scent lingered long after Henry's empire turned to dust.